Hello and welcome to SecurityDNA. I'm your moderator, Steve Lasky. Let's agree that we are convening, gentlemen, at a critical inflection point in U.S. cybersecurity policy, a moment defined by the dual rollout of both FedRAMP 20X and CMMC 2.0. So, on one hand, we're looking at the federal government reimagining how it authorizes cloud services, shifting from static document-heavy reviews to automated real-time assessments through FedRAMP 20X. And on the other hand, DoD contractors are now subject to newly codified cybersecurity maturity model certification 2.0, which launched the 10th as well. And that streamlined certification introduces self-assessment and aligns tightly with NIST standards. So let's explore today those implications. And I want to encourage us to consider not just what these changes mean for compliance, but how they're going to recalibrate the assumptions around trust, responsibility, cyber resilience across the defensive industrial base. However, I think we're going to see, like we talked off camera before we started, that both FedRAMP 20X and CMMC 2.0 will also influence commercial and industrial sectors well beyond federal contracting. They're already reshaping expectations now for cloud security, cyber chain hygiene, and how organizations demonstrate continuous outcome-based cybersecurity. So we can also address that angle as we get into our conversation here. So why don't you both briefly just kind of give us a little bit about your journey into the security and compliance arena, and what got us here today.
Yeah, happy to get us started here. So, I'm Shrav, started Secureframe almost 6 years ago now to essentially help companies with their security and compliance. And one of the things that, I learned from working at a bunch of startups and, tech companies before this is that security and compliance is oftentimes like an afterthought. It's really hard to, know what's the right stuff to get in place. How do I get it in place? What's the right tooling to use? And one of the first things that we saw every company struggle with was getting compliant with security standards like SOC 2, ISO 27001, or HIPAA or PCI. If you're dealing with healthcare data or financial data, you're going to have to run into some of these frameworks. So we basically built Secureframe to help automate automate all the things that you need to do to get those cybersecurity certifications. So we started kind of on the commercial side. We've always kind of helped, companies with their federal frameworks as well. But now, like you said, we're entering this inflection point where, FedRAMP is changing, CMMC 2.0 is being implemented. And it's worth going into some of the differences between those two because they are very different in terms of who it's applicable to. But I'll let Marc kind of maybe give his, brief introduction to the industry.
Great. Yeah, thanks for having me, Steve. My name is Marc Rubbinaccio. I've been with Secureframe for the last 5 years, working with Shrav to help automate compliance and the efforts around maintaining a lot of these cybersecurity frameworks. Before that, I was a cybersecurity auditor. So I've seen and I've personally performed assessments during the times when a lot of this automation and continuous monitoring was not in place or easily implemented. A lot of the struggles that I used to see on site at these audit engagements were a lot of these companies were just not really prepared for the actual audit itself. I would go on site and we'd be scrambling to try and find a lot of the evidence in relation to controls that these organizations stated that they had in place, but really haven't checked since last year, right? And then during that period of time, there's significant infrastructure changes, software platform changes that may have been monitored on a scale in terms of the business, but not so much on the compliance side of things. So what Shrav and I and the team at Secureframe are trying to do is get compliance to be more effortless and monitored and streamlined throughout the entire year. Instead of scrambling when the auditor comes in, knowing that you have all of your evidence being collected throughout the year is a sign of relief, and then also will save a lot of time and money if your report is being delivered on time and the auditor has everything they need to actually perform the assessment.
That's a great overview. I appreciate that. You both have already navigated and are helping your customers navigate this major compliance shift here. So requirements like FedRAMP 20X and CMMC 2.0 are definitely shift, some thinking and approaches on how organizations approach their compliance requirements. But from your guys' perspective, how significant is a shift at this moment for defense contractors compared to maybe other sectors?
Yeah, happy to answer. So I mean, this shift, I mean, I don't even know if you can call it a shift, but CMMC 2.0 is basically a new cybersecurity framework that every federal every defense contractor that deals with CUI, so classified information, basically from the DoD, they all have to get this. So maybe just to repeat that more clearly, if you were a defense contractor that's dealing with classified information, what we usually call CUI, then you are going to need CMMC level 2. If you are doing any sort of business with the DoD, whether it's with classified work or non-classified work, you will need to get CMMC level 1, which is a self-attestation. So prior to this, like, there have been requirements to comply with NIST 171, which is kind of like is very similar to CMMC, and it's what CMMC is based off of. But no one really followed it. There was no enforcement. So what a lot of folks, were doing was they just checked some boxes saying, hey, yeah, we're NIST 170, we're NIST, 171 compliant or whatnot. And of course, like, many of these folks weren't. Like, it's a pretty, beefy framework to actually comply with. So now the DoD basically said, hey, we need to actually enforce this, especially for classified information. So you're going to have to get a third-party audit if you have a contract that requires CMMC level 2, which it should if it has CUI. So that's kind of the main premises for CMMC. So it's you could argue it's a shift from hey, having to kind of self-attest to NIST, but quite frankly, there is no baseline of security for most of our defense industrial base. Many of these folks, we scanned, all their domain names and emails that were, publicly available, and we found out that about 30 to 40% of folks are still using personal email services like Google Workspace or, regular Microsoft sign-in or, Hotmail or whatever people are using these days, and they aren't even actually on a commercial provider. It's maybe not as bad as it sounds, because I don't think there's been major breaches of Google or anything as of recent, but it's not really what you're supposed to be doing to follow these frameworks. There's a lot of requirements that go into it.
Yeah, one thing is the data that's protected could fall under two different categories, right? There's FCI, or federal contract information, and that is when you're receiving specific sensitive data within the actual contracts themselves, but it's not considered what the DoD defines as CUI. And then there's specific levels and requirements if you're handling what's considered FCI. If you're handling CUI, or controlled unclassified information, so this information, not necessarily a specific classification, it's not classified information, but it is controlled unclassified information, which is a very specific distinction that the DoD makes in relation to this data. If you are handling this sort of data, that's when you fall into a different scope and different levels in relation to CMMC. And a lot of that has been clarified over the last year or so through the final ruling and everything like that. I believe the biggest shift in terms of where we were previously to where we are now, November 10th, a lot of these requirements are now becoming hard required in contracts and new contracts, is previously the DoD relied a lot on self-assessments. A lot of organizations were able to kind of state that they were CMMC compliant. They were able to kind of upload that within the SPURS system and everything. And a lot of the reliance was on these companies just promising that they're compliant. And a lot of what these organizations have seen, and when I say organizations, I mean MSPs, IT folks, security folks that are helping these organizations become compliant now to CMMC, is that previously they were promising they were, but they were using these, commercial services to kind of share CUI, whether that's over email, over insecure services like FTP, or whatever the case may be. And they were stating that it's meeting a lot of these NIST 800-171 requirements, which are incredibly granular and, quite frankly, require a lot of security controls in order to actually meet the hard requirements. So the shift here is that the DoD is kind of requiring, but also implying that level 2 or C3PAO third-party led assessments are going to be the best path forward in terms of CMMC compliance. If you're bidding for these contracts, the DoD is going to be looking at your level of CMMC compliance, and then kind of if you're level 2 certified by a third-party auditor, you're going to be able to kind of jump the bids from folks that aren't or just self-assessing CMMC compliance. And the reason why, it's saving DoD time in relation to actually verifying that they're CMMC compliant or meeting these requirements, and then it would eventually save money in the future in case there is a breach or in case there are security control implications in the future. So as of right now, the shift is going from allowing a lot of these self-certifications to leaning into the third-party level 2 led certifications.
When you look at it, at the end of the day, it's not just about winning contract. It's about survival for these folks. I mean, for many, failure to comply is going to could shut them out from defense markets altogether. And of course, when you look at other regulated industries like finance or healthcare, they face intense compliance demands too. But when the DoD's approach creates this contractual, reputational, and cyber risk in tandem, and then when you look at the CMMC, it's not just another regulation. It's like a gatekeeper for future defense work, making this probably one of the most consequential cybersecurity inflection points for defense contractors in decades. So, I mean, this is a big deal. So, considering all of that in terms of readiness, how are most companies reacting? Are they scrambling? Are they planning? Or are they just waiting things out, Shrav?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I think our answer to this might differ a lot from, other CMMC auditors in the CMMC community. I think a lot of people don't understand what does the average life of a defense contractor, look like. And a lot of the folks that are, CMMC auditors today, they, typically are, auditing SOC 2 or some of these other frameworks where you're dealing with IT people, very technically sound folks. And the stuff that you have to comply with for SOC 2 and stuff is not nearly as rigid as what you have to do for NIST, 800, 171. So, if you look at the average defense contractor, most of these are not, single source vendors, and they're not lucky enough to be, Palantir, Boeing, Lockheed Martin. Those folks, they're going to be fine. They get DIBCAC audits. They, I don't really think that's the security concern. It's all the subcontractors underneath them in the supply chain that might just be making a part or two or have a very small piece and, making a Boeing plane or whatever these folks are, manufacturing. And a lot of these folks, they don't do enough business kind of, even indirectly with their DoD that deals with classified information to justify the cost of compliance. And so, what I would say that we've been seeing is the average price to get CMMC compliant, to get an audit in your hand, all the tooling and things that you need to get done is probably above, probably around $200,000 to $300,000 a year. For a very small company, we're talking, 25 people. And this is probably the average rate. I don't think I've seen anything lower than $100,000, all in. And so if you basically have, let's call it, less than $1 million of revenue with the DoD, and the average, I think, defense contractor margin is something like 8 to 10%. It's a tough world. You can't. It doesn't make sense for you to spend that, $100K in profit that you have right now on, security and compliance. And I think a lot of auditors and people in the space don't realize that or recognize that. And, the common saying that people will have is oh, well, you're supposed to be following these NIST requirements from 6-7 years ago. And yes, that's all true. This is something that people have been, starting to do. Or they were supposed to be doing it many years ago, but I don't think we've really made it easy to do. I think all of a sudden these requirements just popped up. And all of a sudden it's going to cost you, $100,000, $200,000, $300,000. I literally had, defense contractor I was on the phone with say, hey, Shrav, we could buy Secureframe and we probably need to, but with this money, I could buy 3 really nice cars and accelerate my business that way. And I'm oh, well, when you put it that way, it definitely sounds rough, or definitely sounds very expensive. But the other thing that we're trying to do here is we're trying to make it more accessible to all these defense contractors. And I want to be clear, because like I know people don't like it when we say, hey, we're going to make this affordable, because people tend in our world tend to equate affordability with like taking a shortcut or having a lower quality audit. And that's just not true. And I want to cover that up front. So I'm really glad you covered this question, because it's the number one thing that people will push. Every C3PAO, those are the folks that do the audits for CMMC level 2. DIBCAC does them for CMMC level 3, themselves, directly with the government, but a very small subset of people. So basically, a lot of these folks will just say, hey, like, we're better than the other, or like, hey, that's a low quality audit. Like, no, there is a set standard that your audit has to be completed by. All these auditors get audited by DIBCAC directly by the government in order to get their accreditation status. This is not a question of quality. There is a bar and a very specific way that these audits have to be done. There are no shortcuts or anything to be really taken. What we're actually trying to do, to be very, very clear, is we are trying to make it easy and accessible. We are not trying to give people shortcuts. We are not cutting out these costs. So the first thing I like to tell an auditor that says, oh, like, no one can do this for $300,000, or you're getting scammed because it costs $300,000, or sorry, you're getting scammed because it costs 50 grand and it should cost 300. What I would go back to with all those auditors, and what I tell our customers to ask is, how much of the audit is actually like, human labor, actual hard cost that you have? And then how much of it is just margin for yourselves? Can that part be cut down? Probably. And then it doesn't have to cost 300 grand. And look, auditors don't really like that question for a reason. Just because an audit costs a little bit less doesn't mean that they get to follow a different bar. So I want to make it very clear that all C3PAOs, and we're not a C3PAO, we partner with C3PAOs, they all have to meet the same bar when auditing your organization for CMMC compliance. So what we're trying to do is we're creating an all-in-one suite to make it super easy to get CMMC compliant. You'll basically connect, your Office suite, or we'll help provision one for you with either Google Workspace or GCC High. Those are the only two options that you can use today for your Office suite. I think there's some other, smaller solutions, but of the big two, you have to use GCC High, and you can't use Microsoft Commercial Cloud right now. It lost its FedRAMP moderate or FedRAMP high designation, one of the others. You can't use it anymore. Probably intentionally designed that way so that you have to pay, 70% more for GCC High. But you can use Google Workspace. You just have to configure it with certain settings to be CMMC level 2 compliant. So what Secureframe does is we integrate with those tools, we configure it, we establish who should have access to CUI, who shouldn't, and then we allow you to provision an enclave where you can use virtual desktops that are set up, securely configured and monitored instantly. And if you use any other platform or go to anyone else today, they have to provision these things manually. It takes like 8 to 10 weeks just to get your virtual desktop set up. Anytime you have a new employee, you're going to have to reach out to a human, get it done. It takes like another week to provision a machine, a week to turn it off. So with Secureframe, it's just a couple button clicks. If you want to add a new machine, you click provision and you select the hard drive space, the memory, Windows 11, and you're good to go. And you just open it up with the Windows app. So once your enclave is provisioned, we will then generate all the documentation that you need to show that, hey, you're CMMC compliant, your CUI is properly protected, and we can get it for you done much, much quicker than anyone else because of all the automation that we use. And it's precisely configured. A human can make a mistake, forget to configure an important setting like encryption. A computer won't make that mistake. Right. So that's what Secureframe's doing, and we can make it much more accessible and affordable, pretty much like probably a fifth to sixth of the rates that you're seeing in the market today.
Mark, to Shrav's point, when you're working with clients and advising them, what's surprising you the most about navigating FedRAMP 20X, and where are companies underestimating the cost and the effort to get these implemented?
Yeah, I think to cover the last point and just add something where Shrav said, right? It's like a lot of organizations are ignoring CMMC right now, right, or they're just completely unaware. And I feel like they're falling into one of those two buckets. One, they're unaware because maybe their primes or their direct contractors that are responsible for the DoD relationship, they're not kind of letting their supply chain know that CMMC is coming. And
So I mean, so when you're talking about primes versus subs and large versus small firms, they're approaching these changes in different ways.
I believe so, yeah. So the primes and the bigger contractors that are directly in a relationship with the Department of Defense, they're a little bit more tuned into what's going on from what we've seen. And then these are the folks that are, maybe they're getting ahead of it. They're, performing the readiness. They're going through the CMMC assessments well earlier before those Department of Defense contracts are coming in. Now, those supply chains and then those folks that might be looking to work with the DoD in the future, it's possible that they're unaware of what the requirements are, what levels they need to meet, what are the specific security controls, and like how much is this all going to cost? What's the level of effort internally? That's like a big gap that we're seeing in the market. So that's why Shrav and I are trying to relay this information out, try and reach those industries and those verticals, and kind of let them know that, hey, just because you don't have a direct contract with the DoD doesn't mean that you're not responsible for these CMMC requirements. So there are a lot of folks out there that just don't have the knowledge or don't really know that these requirements are affecting them. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is they see that CMMC is out there. They know that they handle CUI, but they're kind of just ignoring it or waiting because their current contract is not affected, right? But that is going to change at the point in which they need to renew their contract, or if their direct contractor or the DoD is now requesting that they do a heavier assessment. So like a level 2 third-party audit. Now these requirements are going to come into place a lot sooner than they expected, right? The reason why they might be ignoring CMMC is, one, they're receiving a lot of these quotes from the C2POs and the MSPs, and it's just blindly expensive without understanding the scope or exactly how they handle CUI. Like Shrav was mentioning, if one of these small organizations is just receiving CUI via email back and forth, there are more secure, easier, and more affordable ways to kind of handle that transmission, where you can isolate that CUI environment through a FedRAMP moderate authorized provider, and then only look at those controls when it comes to the CMMC compliance. So to kind of add on to what Shrav was saying before, I do think like a lot of organizations right now, they're either unaware or they're blatantly ignoring it because of the price or the requirements or the responsibility, and they're not really seeing the need for it today.
And obviously they don't understand what the consequences are either, Shrav, do they?
Yeah. It's like Real ID in the sense that, like, okay, no one took it seriously. I think he was like enforced for like last 2-3 years. And then I think all of a sudden, like May or June of this year, you can't get on a plane. So now everyone's like, okay, I'm going to get a Real ID. And it's a priority for me now. So it's a lot like that. Like, people aren't going to spend 100, 200 grand, 300 grand on this stuff unless they really know that they have to comply with it. But also, what the DoD tends to do is they defer to the primes for something like this. That's like very common if we look at DoD or Department of War history. We've now kind of seen all the major primes issue letters to their supply chains saying, hey, like, you guys need to get this done. This is like happening for real. If you look at the actual like numbers for CMMC level 2, those are the ones that require, again, like the third-party audit and where you really need to get started ahead of time. There's something like 80,000 people or contractors that are expected to get this. And from our estimates, we think that about 50 to 60,000 of those subcontractors are actually just subcontractors of just 5 primes. The obvious ones like Boeing, RTX, Lockheed, General Dynamics, and Northrop. They pretty much have 70 to 80% of these folks as subcontractors today. So that's really who's going to be like enforcing this in typical fashion.
I'm going to throw this out to both of you, and one of you guys can answer, or you both can answer. If you're a contractor, you're juggling multiple mandates right now. What's the smartest way to prioritize what your needs and your compliance mandates ought to be?
Yeah, I can jump into this one. It's prioritizing the compliance and the different mandates that you have is the first step and the most important step, right? The good thing is a lot of these frameworks and these mandates, they all kind of have very similar control structure. Because if you look at things like PCI DSS, you look at FedRAMP, you look at CMMC, all the requirements are around the protection of sensitive data. The only difference is the specific data that you're protecting, right? So a lot of the times, if you do have multiple frameworks that you need to meet in order to fulfill different responsibilities that you have. So if you have a contractual agreement with the Department of Defense or a prime, then you need CMMC. If you're handling payment data to facilitate one of your other commercial services, then you're going to need PCI DSS, right? And then how you prioritize those is quite difficult because it's possible that you need to be meeting all of these things whether or not you want to, right? So the best way that Shrav and I have seen in the industry today in order to kind of handle all of these and juggle all of these different frameworks is to implement a solution in which you have visibility into all of the controls that these frameworks require, and then what is the actual overlap between those frameworks. So it's possible that, based on your scope and your services, that if you implement a handful of controls for CMMC, it's likely you're meeting a handful of controls in the other frameworks that you need to meet as well. So instead of trying to juggle all of these different frameworks separately, trying to understand the specific requirements within each framework, your best bet is to kind of build an organizational platform in which you have visibility into all of these frameworks and the different controls, and you can see exactly step by step what you need to do throughout the year to meet and maintain all of those frameworks easily.
Very good. If you guys could give one piece of advice to the CEO or the CISO that's staring down this fall's compliance deadlines, what would it be?
I would just say get started early, start taking action early, and use some sort of software platform like Secureframe. I know it's a little bit of a shill, but I really do think that we add a lot of value here, help people get all these compliance requirements met much quicker, and it is pretty much the way that everyone's going about this. Big thing is start early, start taking action on it now. Don't wait till the last minute, because this is not something that you could just do in a couple days. This is not SOC 2 where you could get it done in a couple weeks typically.
Yeah, I add on to that, and I agree with Shrav. Previously, we talked about the importance of mapping all of the frameworks together and the use of software to do that. That's a reason why I think a lot of organizations should be looking into software to help manage their compliance efforts. It's a lot more affordable, a lot more efficient, and easier to use than trying to hire an entire compliance team to kind of manage all of these things individually. Not only does a software platform like Secureframe organize and manage all of the requirements throughout these different frameworks and then show you the mapping between them to make it more efficient in terms of meeting these objectives, but we have connections into all of your technology that you're already using, and we have visibility of a lot of the configurations and those controls and how they're meeting those compliance framework requirements today. It's a lot easier to take a look at a dashboard and then see in real time what is compliant, where is their compliance drift, and then how to actually implement a lot of those controls and configurations to effectively maintain 100% compliance across these frameworks throughout the year. Like my story earlier, where I was doing audits on site, and basically my entire job was verifying that these controls are in place, collecting evidence for these controls, realizing that a lot of controls weren't in place because there wasn't a discussion about these over the course of the previous year, realizing that all this evidence for controls that they say are in place is not easily accessible. That would extend the timelines of our audits. That would extend the cost of these audits. And it would extend, the amount of effort that it would take for a lot of these companies to meet and maintain compliance. So my recommendation for all the companies out there, big and small, definitely use software to maintain and manage a lot of the compliance requirements. We talked about FedRAMP 20X a little bit, but one of the main shifts in governance, in compliance, is using automation to collect and view evidence in real time. It's no longer taking a look at a screenshot that showed a configuration like 6 months ago, saying that something was in place. Instead, a lot of auditors want to see that in machine readable export language and stating that these configurations are in place today. So that would be my recommendation.
Gentlemen, great discussion. Hopefully with FedRAMP and CMMC, we're raising the baseline for good cybersecurity in the marketplace, and not just confusing the hell out of these people. So, so even if you don't contract with the federal government, though, your customers, insurers, your partners are going to increasingly expect this continuous, measurable assurances for programs that they're promoting. So I think you guys gave us a great overview. I'd love to have another discussion, whether we do it here or I get you guys to do an article for us on how this might spill over into the commercial environment or the enterprise environment as well, to see how this may have some effect. I think there certainly is going to be some spillover there. So Shrav, Marc, I appreciate it, and we will talk to you soon.